21st century is a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, or simply known as the VUCA world. To be responsive and relevant, engaging to evidence-based practice is one of the adaptive ways that education leaders and teachers can do. So what is evidence-based practice? It is about making decisions through consensus, explicit, and judicious use of the best available evidence from the multiple sources to increase the likelihood of a favorable outcome. As you can see, there are three main ideas that are important to consider in this definition. First is decision making, second is best available evidence, and last is to increase favorable outcome. But before we unpack these main ideas, let us try to be familiar first with the process of EBP, which is presented by 6 A's. There are 6 essential steps involved in EBP, and these are to ask, acquire, appraise, aggregate, apply, and assess. To ask is to simply translate a practical issue or problem into an answerable question. After asking what the need is, it's important to acquire systematically and search and retrieve important evidence. To appraise is to look at the trustworthiness and the relevance of your evidence. From there, you aggregate, you try to weigh and pull together the evidence, which ones are relevant and are useful in your practice. Then you will incorporate them, apply into evidence-based decision-making process through a specific intervention. And lastly, you would have to assess your actions, evaluate the outcome of the decisions taken. To complete our definition of evidence-based practice, we can say that EBP is about making decisions by asking, acquiring, appraising, aggregating, applying, and assessing so that you could increase the likelihood of a favorable outcome. Now, let us unpack the three main ideas involved in EBP. First, let's talk about decision making. You have to remember that as education leaders and teachers, sound decision making should come from assessing your needs because it is our moral obligation and it is a skill set that need to be enhanced. In order to make sound decisions, need assessment must be facilitated so that you can address the gap. Simply put, needs assessment is looking at discrepancy or a gap for what is and what should be. This is a systematic set of procedures that you use to determine needs so that you can set your priorities. For instance, this is your current state and this is your desired state. So that you could fill the gap, the learning gap, it's very important to look at the details of the evidence presented. This is an example of a specific needs assessment where the need is about the children migrant in terms of proficiency level in reading. Now, after getting all the data you have acquired from the needs assessment, it's important to utilize them because this will be your basis for your solutions. And this will make you allocate your resources because you have to remember that resources are scarce and this will help you improve your programs and your services or the teaching learning process in the school. Remember, needs assessment are conducted to identify the right job. In the real world, there is never enough money or resources to meet all our needs. Therefore, educators, whether you are a school head or a teacher, should be skillful in making decisions. Again, decision-making skills should be harnessed because if you only have a hammer, you would think of all problems as snakes. Now, let's go to the second concept, which is about best available evidence. The question to answer is, what counts as evidence. Here, you can see that there is a fusion of evidence-based practice. First, you start with research, or commonly known as the research-informed practice. From there, you can combine it with the expert models. These are theories that you see in the literature, but more importantly, it's important to look at to give back value to your skills and experiences as a practitioner. Then after that, you can also engage into trial and error results, looking at the feedback from different stakeholders, and eventually look at the patterns you discover from all these observations, because this will yield to evidence-based practice. So what sources of evidence should be considered? As you take all these 6 steps in EBP, in summary, evidences should be considered as number 1, the scientific research findings. It's important that you are theoretically grounded in your practice. Of course, you have to factor in your professional experience and judgment. Third, your organizational data, facts, and figures are very important to look keenly on the things happening in your context. And lastly, to look at the stakeholders' values and concerns. So finally, in looking for best available evidence, the question to ask is, why do we have to critically appraise them? Evidence is never perfect. It can be misleading. Therefore, when you critically appraise, it will give you an idea of how trustworthy it is and how relevant it is. Here are some guide questions for you to ask as you critically appraise the evidence that you have gathered. And finally, the third main idea in evidence-based practice is about increasing the favorable outcome. To increase your favorable outcome, EBP is expressed through clinical practice in education. This is a shift from the traditional to clinical approach. Let's start for the education leaders, which involve clinical supervision. Here, you can see that clinical supervision is a vehicle for developing professionals to be responsible, teachers who were capable of analyzing their own performance, were open to change and assistance from others, and who were above all self-directing. Clinical supervision promotes collegial supervision. You can see here that vis-a-vis traditional supervision for education leaders, clinical supervision is focused on the classroom data based on the need, and it is cyclical. Here you can see the simple process of clinical supervision process. Now, for teachers, clinical teaching also have steps and questions that will guide you in your evidence-based practice. This is the clinical teaching cycle of Professor Griffin from Melbourne University. You start with asking yourself, what is the student ready to learn and what evidence supports this? From there, you will have to ask yourself, what are the possible evidence-based interventions? Then you ask, what is the preferred intervention and how will it be resourced and implemented? Then you ask, what is the expected impact on learning and how will this be evaluated? Finally, you ask yourself, what happened and how can this be interpreted? Then you go back to the next step of the cycle. So, taking the fusion of clinical teaching cycle, you can see that this is a clear manifestation of evidence-based practice.